Hello everyone, welcome back to Period 6 of the APUSH curriculum. Today we're going to have Key Concept 6.2.2, the end of the Western frontier. So what we're really dealing with here is almost the continuation of the story of Manifest Destiny. So when we talked about this all the way back at the beginning of Period 5, we were talking about Western expansion and then the land conflicts that invariably occurred because of this expansion into land that was occupied by the Native Americans, but desired by both white settlers and the United States government. We had to stop looking at that for a bit due to the Civil War, due to industrialization, due to other major trends in U.S. history at the time, but now we're going back to that chapter in American history, that theme, and we're essentially looking at how it all ended. Okay, so we're looking at how the Western frontier was closed. So there was no longer this idea of a border of civilization because the United States has spread from sea to shining sea and is now using the land all across the continent as well. So there are winners, there are losers in this story, and we'll see both of those today. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is what's going on with this topic in general. We've talked about the Transcontinental Railroad before, and I don't really have too much else to say about it here, except that it had been built from before the Civil War till after the Civil War, and eventually, I think it's 1869 when it's completed. Remember, the Transcontinental Railroad isn't the idea of just one railroad that goes from point A to point B across the continent. It's many railroads connected with each other that made it possible to use railroads to get across the country, mostly built by Chinese immigrants, finished in Utah in the 1860s. We're going to talk about the other stuff in the descriptor to the left, natural resources, what to do with all this land, and kind of the mythical element of the Western frontier. So first, some resources. So the Comstock lode, this was the name given to a large amount of silver that was found in Nevada. What we're talking about here is new resources are being discovered. In fact, to this day, the state of Nevada is mostly owned by the federal government. Okay, so the discovery of the silver, we did not sort of jump in there the way Spain did and mine so much that it alters our money supply, but it was an issue if people were saying, well, we know all the silver is here, it's in our country on federal land, do we use it to build up silver reserves, or is that going to negatively affect our economy? Meanwhile, in the Northwest, so Washington, Oregon today, there is a large timber business because this was previously really unused land by the United States, and now they realize that they're running out of wood elsewhere in the country, and they need wood to build stuff. So the timber business gets big up there because of the large forests. But what you need to realize is sort of these resource discoveries on their own aren't as important as the question that they bring up. And the question that they bring up is, what should the government do about it? Should the government play a role in protecting nature, or should government promote industry by allowing private industries to buy up this land and use the resources as they see fit? Remember, we are in a period of relative lack of regulation, so that means that for part of the time, they're promoting industry. Later on, once we get into the progressive era later on, I said later on twice there. Sorry about that. We're going to get into an era where more protection is provided by the government. An early form of protection was our national park system. So it was partially used to protect land, partially used to open up the land that is sort of now available through railroads and all this in the interior of in the United States, open it to tourism, open it to settlement. Sort of a fringe benefit for the U.S. government is it got rid of Native American tribes that were occupying the land. So if the federal government decides that the land where tribes were living is now federal property and national park, the federal government's the end of the line, right? So if that tribe didn't already have a treaty, they then lost their land and were driven off of it. Culturally speaking, some clubs developed to promote the preservation of nature. One of the major ones that's still around to this day is called the Sierra Club, developed by a guy named John Muir. There he is to the right, standing with Teddy Roosevelt at Yosemite. He plays an essential role in the creation of national parks, and he's promoting preservationism. He wants to preserve nature for the sake of nature. Now, he and Teddy Roosevelt would begin to disagree about that policy. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to protect nature, but more to be a conservationist, to not preserve nature for its own sake, but to make sure that his generation didn't use up all nature's resources for their interests and not leave any for the future. Okay, so they differ. We're going to talk more about this in Historical Period 7, I believe. So, National Park System, 1872, Yellowstone was made a national park. A couple things were developed a bit beyond our historical period here. The Antiquities Act in 1906 allows the federal government to designate national and natural landmarks. So it was like the national parks, another way the federal government could protect land, basically through the power of the president, not really Congress, and the creation of the National Park Service. So not just designating the land as protected, but providing sort of the park rangers and that system to preserve it through actually having people working there whose job it is to preserve it. Okay, so that's a trend going on. Lastly here, this idea of the Western mythos. So the idea of fulfilling manifest destiny, of closing off the western frontier. This was mostly generated by a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner, who wrote something called the Frontier Thesis in 1890. What he was claiming is that the frontier was closed. East had met west. If you look at the map down there, you can see population densities. So you can see that the west was populated before stuff in between the Midwest and the far west really started. I lost my train of thought. Those two areas got populated before the place in the middle. But he was saying enough people and enough railroads, enough everything was moving in there that it was no longer an open frontier, a border with civilization. He was saying that this was closed, and he said this developed the American identity. He related it to manifest destiny and said that we were different from Europe in how we grew. He characterizes Europe as growing through wars, growing through taking over country from taking over land from other countries involved, and imperialism. He characterized ours as a natural spreading across the continent through manifest destiny and through ideals rather than conquest. So it's a very ideal way of looking at it. When you look at kind of the nitty-gritty that we really did fight wars against the Native Americans, his thesis really doesn't stand up from a modern point of view of looking back at this topic. Okay, and we'll see some of those topics in just a little bit. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the white settlers that are moving into this land. A lot of people were looking for greater independence and owning land in the first place. Remember, land within Western civilization means power, it means status. So if you're a landless person, you feel that you have less autonomy and less power in society. So many people started moving west to do that. One of the main ways that people got land was something called the Homestead Act from 1862. The deal was that you could get 160 acres of free land from the federal government if you were willing to move west and to improve the land. And what that means is that you're not saying, yeah, I'll take some free land and not use it. You had to move there, live there, and use it in a productive way. Ideally farming, right? So this causes many landless people, Easterners, to populate the West. Kind of had a dual goal. Earlier, notice this is during the Civil War. This was promoted before the Civil War as a way to promote free labor over slavery, so the South prevented it from happening. It passes during the Civil War because the South isn't there to participate in the creation of the law. Okay, the other thing was to get people populating the West in order so that it could develop as a system. In many ways, you can look at the Homestead Act in kind of a similar way to how Mexico encouraged Americans to move to Texas when after it had its revolution. It understood that you need to be using the land in a productive way in order to contribute to the economy. Otherwise, it's just sitting there, and they wanted to give people an incentive to go there. So these people were called the Homesteaders. And what they had to use in order to make this land arable and usable was the steel plow. Remember, we talked about, who was it? John Deere's steel plow before. Steel, of course, is a much hardier metal. What happens with steel is you're taking iron, but you're mixing it in with carbon. And what happens is as you pound the carbon into the iron, it's filling in the gaps between the atoms of iron, which strengthen it and also makes it more rust and more resistant to oxidation. It was more powerful, and it had to be used because it had to break up this land that was really not meant for widespread cultivation. They're going to the Great Plains that was previously open range, with the Indians relying on what the environment afforded, hunting the bison and the buffalo, and being nomadic. Now you have white settlers moving there, staying in one place, trying to make land grow things that it does not naturally grow, so things like grain and corn. So they have to use the tools and use methods that really didn't fit what the land was affording them. Okay? Another group that moved there, part of the homesteaders, were called the Exodusters. The key word there is Exodus. So, second book of the Bible, in which Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt and out of slavery. Now, they were called this because the Exodusters were African Americans moving west, out of the South, trying to flee Jim Crow. So, they kind of had this feeling like they were trying to get out of slavery in order to have more freedom, and they had to travel a far way in order to get away from that. Okay, so really they're having a similar experience to the homesteaders, but of course they're still moving to this land, and it's not like discrimination and racism didn't exist. It's just that there were fewer people, so there was not sort of institutionalized racism within the West as much as there was in the South. Another group, women in the West. Most of the people that were homesteaders were families. Okay, so if you've ever, I know my mom read it to us when I was a kid, Little House on the Prairie. They were homesteaders. This is the story of Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family when they moved from, God, I think they were from Minnesota or Wisconsin, and they're moving into this Great Plains area in order to, they had to build their own house. They had to figure out how to use the land. They had interactions with Native Americans. But what you need to realize is women in the West often had increased public sphere roles. So there weren't as many people, so the institutions weren't established, and because they owned their own 160 acres of land, women often had greater responsibilities, especially if the men had to travel far away from the homestead. The women were then responsible for running the farm. And what this meant is Western states were often more open to women being able to vote, female suffrage, before other more established states. Why? Well, they already had greater responsibilities socially and economically, so when we move forward to political rights, it only seemed natural that they should have that as well, because they're operating in a much more independent way. Some of the first states to give women the right to vote are Wyoming and Utah, and this is where many homesteaders were going within that region. Now, the challenges of being a homesteader was the bad weather. Okay, a lot of this area is known as Tornado Alley. So tornadoes are coming around. Blizzards, so the areas become very cold in the winter. So they're growing, corn and wheat during the growing seasons, but otherwise it's freezing. It was a very inhospitable environment to live. We live in California, of course. I encourage you to look at maps of the temperatures when we get into winter. Okay. Compared to us, we're sitting down here, it's like 60, 70 degrees. It's getting below zero there, something that we really don't understand. Also, there were kind of these almost seeming like biblical plagues like the locust. So locusts are kind of these types of grasshopper, that's what they kind of look like. And they come through certain cycles through their reproduction. And what will happen is every so many years, there's basically just these swarms of locusts that come in and devour all the crops, making sort of, if that happens to the whole area, famine and sort of loss of ability to cultivate your goods. Now, a problem with the Homestead Act as well was it was only for 160 acres. And okay, that seems like a lot of land, but think about it this way. What if you wanted to expand and buy more land? You weren't allowed to. You could only have those 160 acres. You had someone on every side who owned the 160 acres around you. And the land wasn't meant for large-scale cultivation, which I already talked about a little bit earlier with the steel plow. Okay, so people are moving west. So what is the effect on the environment as these white settlers are taking over the land? Now, part of it has to do with what is the effect on the Native Americans already living there. This frontier mentality acts like there's a border with civilization, but civilization was already there among the Native Americans and all these very diverse tribes. During the Civil War, the federal government was able to pursue policies that pushed them off their land. Here's some prime examples. So the Dakota Sioux, were paid to give up their land. They never really got the funds, but they made various treaties with the federal government that defined where their land was. Tribes like the Nez Perce, they were chased to Canada. So this is kind of ironic. They were chased to Canada because they were fleeing to Canada. They want to get out of the United States so they weren't pursued by the federal government anymore, and the government actually stopped them from going there. Okay? If they wanted to get rid of them, why didn't they just let them go? I don't have the answer. Okay? It was really a policy of control rather than of actually, they wanted to control them, so they forced them to stay here. Okay? And sometimes things like this would result in violence. An example there is the Sand Creek Massacre. This happened in Chicago, Colorado, during the Civil War. So remember, the Civil War, states are taking sides, so there are militias within Colorado that are trying to fight within the Civil War. And when they run into natives looking to sort of solidify the Union's position, they attack the Indians and kill and massacre many of them. Most were women and children. Okay, so you can see there are policies from the federal government looking to just get the natives off their land tribe by tribe, but then there were kind of these blanket policies that affected many different tribes, like the Transcontinental Railroad. So understand, to build that railroad through these areas, they were going to have to go through area claimed by different tribes, and sometimes those tribes have had treaties that guaranteed them their territorial sovereignty. I'll get to one of these later, so let me save that idea. But eventually, treaties were renegotiated, and as the railroad constructors and contractors would come through, they would hire people like Buffalo Bill Cody, who would basically go through the land that the federal government was building the railroad upon and just slaughter all the buffalo. So there was a practical concern, the idea that if the railroad's traveling through here and the train's going fast, early trains couldn't slow down quickly or didn't have great brakes. So if there's a buffalo just standing on the middle of the track and it's not moving as the train's coming, it could hit it and completely derail the train, and the people on the train would probably die and all their resources would be lost because a buffalo was standing there. So the company said, let's clear away the buffalo so that it doesn't cause problems for the railroad, but there was another plan here too. The buffalo, the bison, represented a source of life for the Great Plains natives that were still there. So if you got rid of their source of life, you were going to decimate the way that they could eat, the way that they could survive, have things to burn, and you were also decimating their culture, which was tied in to the hunting of the buffalo and these different cycles throughout the year. If you look to the upper right there, there is a giant mound of buffalo skulls. So what that represents is just the sheer scale that these people pursued the end of Native American tribes. Okay, you can see these two guys standing right there. There's a man right there, and there's a man right there. Okay, it's a gigantic mound of buffalo killed just to benefit the railroad and to decimate Native American populations. Something else that came through that led to sort of the fleeing of the natives from the land and forcing them off their land were ranchers. So as more white settlers moved into the land, they were using the land to have their cattle graze and then eventually slaughter them and sent them off to markets, especially in Chicago. But as they used the land, they were replacing the buffalo or the bison with cattle. Okay, so by 1970, the bison was almost entirely driven to extinction. Today, they don't even exist in the wild. You'll still see them, but they're domesticated. All right, so cattle driving helped lead to that. One of these elements of ranchers was the long drive, so having to go from your ranch to driving all the cattle for slaughter to railroad towns, so they would then be sent up north, especially to the slaughterhouses in Chicago. The Chicago slaughterhouses had meatpacking industries, which they would then cut the meat, make a sausage, whatever. We'll look at the jungle later. And send those all around the country to be eaten. Okay? So, because they're driving their cattle through many tracts of land, it means that it's driving the Indians and the bison away from land that they used to live upon. Okay, all throughout the West, boomtowns were sort of set up. A boomtown is like an economic boom. So this town is in some area that didn't used to be ideal for economics. Suddenly, the train's going through there, or that's where the long drive is going through. It was a place for people to stop. So a town was created, almost seeming like overnight, to provide institutions to support the economy. Okay, so land near railroads became very valuable if the railroad went near certain areas. Land that was previously not desirable would become desirable because of the railroad. Okay, ranchers also started using barbed wire to define property lines, and this kind of ended that open range idea of you basically being able to travel across the Great Plains with no impediments aside from nature. Now there was the problems of nature that you would encounter along with barbed wire and fences, so you could not go onto some people's land. Okay, so you can see the landscape economically and naturally is being drastically altered because of this movement west, both by people and then by changes in the natural systems as well. Okay, so the rest of the story is the story of what happened to the Native Americans because of this new policy of westward migration. It's following the same trend of what we saw with the Trail of Tears of Indian removal before. You can see on the left, it's talking about the U.S. government violating treaties that they themselves made. When we look at the history of Native Americans in the United States, it's really a history of treaties made and treaties broken when it serves the government's needs. So, that's what I just said. Let's look at some of these treaties made and treaties broken. Okay, some of the major ones that you should probably know are the Fort Laramie treaties. These were made with the Lakota Sioux. One of the major ones made with the Lakota had to do with allowing the Transcontinental Railroad to pass through land that they had previously made a treaty about that they had sovereignty over. So I think the first Treaty of Fort Laramie guaranteed their territorial sovereignty in kind of what's North Dakota, South Dakota today. But then the government wanted to build the railroad through there. So they made the second Treaty of Fort Laramie, in which it said that they were still guaranteeing their sovereignty, provided that they allow the federal government to build the railroad through their land. Okay, so they had to make sort of a concession there, but it still guaranteed their sovereignty. We're going to see this doesn't last. The Supreme Court made a ruling in Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock that eventually made Native wards of the federal government. And what that means is that Natives really didn't have citizenship rights. They didn't have civil rights that other Americans would. It defined them as sort of the responsibility of the federal government to make policies for them without input from the natives themselves. I already talked about how national parks would legally seize native lands through basically new treaties. So you can see that the laws were constantly changing and it was chipping away at native sovereignty. Remember, natives were pushed off to this land in the first place because of people like Andrew Jackson, who said it's for their own good to be west of the Mississippi. Well, now, these very people that were guaranteed their territorial sovereignty, that they were in land that the U.S. government wasn't going to bother with, are now in land that the U.S. government wants, that white people and settlers want. And suddenly, those previous treaties don't matter anymore because it doesn't align with the goals of the government anymore. Now, one of the prime examples of this had to do with the Lakota Sioux. Okay, so many tribes just went along, they moved to reservations that basically took away their land and limited what land rights they had to a very small area, usually the worst land too. Lakota Sioux refused to give up their territory because of those treaties of Fort Laramie. They said, we were guaranteed our territorial sovereignty, you can't take it away. That's a federal law that you made, you can't break the treaty you just made with us. Okay? They were trying to also preserve their culture, not just their land. This was called the Ghost Dance movement. So a lot of the natives within the Lakota were saying our culture is being also sort of limited and assimilated because of these policies. We need a resurgence of cultural autonomy, not just land sovereignty. So they're restoring traditions, and this was a problem for the government because it showed that resistance was possible. And when we look at the Battle of Little Bighorn, I don't like my intonation there. The Battle of Little Bighorn, there we go. We see that it was also possible that this territorial sovereignty, these goals, this cultural autonomy, could be successful in fighting the U.S. government. And that was going to be a problem for the government in achieving their goals. What had happened is gold was found on this Indian land that was guaranteed to the Lakota by the Fort Laramie treaties. White settlers started moving in anyway. They didn't care. So As a result of that, there is violence and sort of bloodshed between the natives and the white settlers. And so eventually the U.S. government said, well, we've got to send in the army in order to end this. So U.S. Army went in with Custer as their commander there to fight the Sioux, thinking they'd be able to defeat them. But what happened is every single U.S. soldier there died while fighting. And that made the government say, okay, if these tribes are resisting us, it's possible they can defeat us. Okay? So what that meant is the government had to once again shift its policies to dishonor all previous treaties, to dishonor any rights that might be remaining for the Native Americans, to ensure their success and that the Indians were not successful. And the place we see that is the massacre at Wounded Knee. Now, sometimes people say the battle, but when you look at the details, it was no battle. It was a massacre. In 1890, at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. So Pine Ridge is still a reservation today, and it has some of the worst conditions of any reservation in the country. We're going to watch a video that's going to give you pictures and images to represent that. So what happened is the army showed up and basically just started massacring the Lakota Sioux there. Around 300 of them were massacred. Most of them were women and children. They were basically taken to the very center of the village, lined up, and just shot so they could fall in a mass grave. Okay? The men were mostly out in the surrounding area, and once they heard what was happening, they had to then go in and fight because they weren't located. You can see this was not the goal of that the Indians were fighting and the government was fighting back. It's that the government went in with the goal of massacring them to make an example, to say any more resistance, any more ghost dances or whatever you're going to do will not be tolerated, and it will be sort of persecuted, either one here, with absolutely no mercy. And what happened as a result, the Lakotas stopped resisting, and 1890 represents the end of armed resistance to the government taking over the land. Okay? And what happens as a result is what we'll see on the very next slide. Okay? So with armed resistance over, policy shifted to forced assimilation and Americanization. Okay? Some policies existed about this before Wounded Knee, but it represents the policy that occurs after Wounded Knee all the way into the 1930s even. So one was called the Americanization policy. It was also called Grant's Peace Policy. Now, Grant's Peace Policy was going on when Ulysses S. Grant was president in the, late 1860s through the 1870s. And here's what this policy was. They had to adopt white ways, convert to Christianity, and abandon everything to do with their native cultures. So this might include things like cutting their hair short, even though having long hair was traditionally part of Native American traditions. Only speak English so that they would forget their language and then in the process forget part of their culture. They could wear only white clothing, so modern clothing that was worn by sort of mainstream American civilization, and they had to learn jobs that were being done by other sort of white settlers in the area, or industrialization as well. Okay? You can see an example there on the upper right of exactly what this would look like for Native Americans. On the left, before, and then after, basically trying to make the Indians look and act white and abandon their native culture. And that was the exact effect. It devastated native culture. If you go through several generations of not having access to cultural traditions, you can be sure that a couple generations down the line, they're not going to remember what they were about, or why they did it. So this is kind of that downside to assimilation, is that they're going to lose things that were important to them for millennia, really. Okay, another act of the government was called the Sever Ality Act, and it didn't just attempt to change culture, it attempted to change land rights. So it looked at the reservation system and broke up all that land into 160-acre tracts. So notice, the same amount that people would get through the Homestead Act. So it looked at territory. For each male head of household, he was awarded a 160-acre tract, and if there was if I fast forward here a little bit, if there was more land in the reservation than people living there, the rest was seized by the U.S. government and sold to white ranchers. So you can see, even though treaties defended a certain border as territorial sovereignty, this overruled that. Now, ultimately, the goal was altering their lifestyle, moving from communal lifestyle, nomadic, so using all the land together, to saying, no, it's private property, this is your land, you can't share, trying to change concepts of land, going away from how land was sacred and communal for the tribe to how land was an individual possession to be used and settled and farmed by the personal owner. Okay, so you can see this ties in with land use, but you could say it ties in with culture because it's ruining native concepts of land in the process. Okay, essentially, laws targeted all these distinct aspects to force assimilation: land use, language, religion, and this continues all the way into the 20th century. What you see in the middle there is, for many Native American tribes, the children were taken away from their families on the reservations and forced to attend Native American boarding schools to basically sort of get all the culture and the traditions out of them and force them to integrate with white culture in the process. So this is actually a topic that a teacher at our school, Miss Adkins, did her entire master's thesis on. So I don't know all the details. She knows more than me, so you can go bother her if you want. Okay, and on top of all this, they were denied citizenship. Remember, Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock defined natives as wards of the federal government, which means that they didn't have citizenship rights until the New Deal in the 1930s, when there's an act of Congress that looks to reverse these past injustices. So what this lack of citizenship means is they had no legal right to object having assimilation forced upon them. So this is kind of like Dred Scott, right? In Dred Scott, the court ruled that black people had no right to sue in court because they weren't citizens. Of course, that changes with the 14th Amendment, but because of the laws in the case of Native policies, they didn't have citizenship, so they had no legal right to go to the courts and try to change anything. Okay, they had absolutely zero autonomy over their own lives for a very long time. Okay, so when you look at these past policies, we're sort of done here at this point, you can see why Native issues and sort of policies and what happened is still very controversial to this very day. It's sort of one of these two things, along with slavery, when we look back at history from a modern point of view, that people look at it as like this gigantic blot on American history of, well, how can we say that we represent all these ideals when this is what we did to the people who needed it most? Okay, so nothing new, but still very controversial today. All right, thank you for watching. You know what your next steps are. You've got some cards to make, a quiz to do, geography to study, chronology to take a look at, and a next video if you're really ready to move on. Okay, thank you so much for watching. This is Mr. Chodola, and I will see you in class. Bye.